Hi again. Thanks for responding to discussion 2, which asked you to personally reflect on how global climate change is likely to impact you. In this module, you've been reading about the Anthropocene and different ways of knowing about global climate change. So that's going to be the topic of this brief video. As you probably picked up from the reading, the Anthropocene refers to a period of accelerated human-induced global change. Here is a quote from our reading. Humans are now the main agents shaping geologies and influencing geophysical changes. This is an image from the Industrial Revolution, and it's thought that the current area of intensified human-induced global change began with the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, scientists date the Anthropocene starting about 1850, ongoing through the present. In this week's discussion, I asked you to reflect on the ways the Anthropocene, or global climate change, might affect you personally. And in reading your responses, many students highlighted things that I have also thought about: concern over rising gas prices, concern about changes in weather patterns, droughts some places, flooding in other areas. For me personally, I love to eat, and I love eating avocados every day. So I'm concerned about food supply chains from California and Mexico, where my avocados often come from. But as we will see in the next slides, the Anthropocene and related global climate change affects different communities very differently. But before introducing you to some case studies, I wanted to take a brief moment to acknowledge that due to political dialogue in the United States, there may be some variation in the level of acceptance that global change is a real phenomenon. So here is a quote from our assigned reading, and this is the foundation that I'm basing our course on. After some 30 years of testimony by scientists and 25 years of high-level scientific reports, it is largely accepted that contemporary climate change is real and primarily human-driven. So what we're doing now is thinking about how we think about knowledge. So I have this picture of young Raven-Symoné saying that's so meta, because meta refers to this nesting of analysis. We're thinking about thinking about thinking. Knowledge, what we think we know, is bought into by a community of potential dissenters. Knowledge is therefore culturally produced, and as a product of culture, knowledge adjusts over time. The term you have read about, assemblage, which is a verb, refers to the process of establishing facts. It's the process of buying into what we think we know, and it reflects cultural values. So our assembled knowledge about global change, produced by the scientific cultural community, is this: rapidly changing environmental conditions threaten traditional ways of life because the physical world impacts and sets constraints on human behavior. This phrase in blue represents an anthropological lens through which you will be invited to analyze situations throughout our course. This is called cultural materialism. Cultural materialism, as a theoretical perspective, interprets situations or problems in terms of how the physical world impacts and sets constraints on human behavior. Here's another anthropological frame of reference, or a theoretical lens. Traditional environmental knowledge, TEK for short, respects the idea that local cultural assemblages of facts may differ from Western scientific viewpoints, or they may describe the same phenomena but interpret it in a unique way. And in this way, anthropologists may serve as translators or advocates for traditional assemblages of knowledge that differ from mainstream Western perspectives. This theoretical lens of analysis is sometimes called ethnoecology. So here you have two lenses, and these will develop ongoing throughout our course. You have cultural materialism and ethnoecology. Consider this example. Here is a photograph from Arctic hunters in Greenland, some of whom you read about in the assigned readings for this module. Part of the lifeway of this community involves travel over sea ice by dog sled to visit between communities, traveling to hunting grounds, and so sea ice is very important. 100% of calories come from meat and fish. In these communities, there is an astute understanding of ice conditions that does not exist in my cultural background. For instance, as you read about, information can be gleaned from the color of ice, from the state of slush on the ice surface, the position of icebergs offshore that may indicate melting from below, seabird behavior and wind patterns. All of this inputted information influences the hunter's interpretation of ice conditions. So they understand this in a very detailed, nuanced way. As a result of this astute understanding of ice conditions, Arctic hunters began noticing patterned changes in ice decades before the Western world noticed. But who listened? Well, anthropologists. So anthropologists living among these communities heard complaints about thinning ice that forms later into the winter, and noticed that the result was that some hunting grounds were inaccessible if the ice was too thin to travel to those hunting grounds via dog sled. So it became harder to eat. As a result, the populations began declining. Young men were no longer trained to be hunters. Young women no longer taught to make shoes from sealskins, which have now become unavailable. And so there was this retooling of skills to match changing material conditions. So to these communities of Arctic hunters, climate change is more than an environmental issue. As populations shrink from people migrating elsewhere to have jobs to be able to feed their families, people are lost, but also traditional lifeways are lost. Traditional knowledge is no longer being passed from elders to younger generations, and so this is a cultural identity crisis. None of the responses to our discussion 2 post noted a loss of cultural identity related to global climate change. So it's felt differently by us in the United States than among these Arctic hunters. The noted changes in sea ice conditions that alarmed Arctic hunters represent a traditional environmental knowledge. This is just one case study where local cultural assemblages of facts were and continue to be real, and it points out that sole reliance on Western ideas excludes this important information. These valuable perspectives are sometimes excluded from the dialogue, and anthropologists seek to amplify these voices. Often this is done by writing ethnographies. So here is a book honoring the concept that traditional ecological knowledge is of value, which you might be interested in for optional further study. I want to note that our U.S. or Western perspective also reflects an ethnoecology specific to our own culture. In this belief system about nature, the environment is viewed as separate from the things of mankind, man versus nature. Perhaps linked to that book of Genesis quote I mentioned in a previous video, the environment is seen as something to be exploited for human benefit. Yet, at the same time, we also have an idea that it is morally righteous to protect Mother Earth, and many people pay money to recycle. Heavens, what would your neighbors think of you if you were the only family on the street without a blue bin on trash pickup day? Now let's turn our attention to this infographic. These lines reflect responses to a poll that asked Americans if environmental protection should be a policy priority and if economic growth should be a policy priority. Notice that the lines are mirror images. When people valued environmental protection more, that's the green line, they valued economic growth less, that's the yellow line, as if these two were truly trading off. But in our class, we will explore the possibility that protecting the environment can also promote economic growth. So if I were responding to this poll, I might value them both highly. And if our culture shifted towards this perspective, the lines on this infographic would converge, similar to what we see here in 2010, which I don't really have an explanation for. That would be an interesting follow-up study. Here's a third case to consider. This image is from a community in the Marshall Islands, where the ocean threatens to extinguish culture, where climate change is discussed like genocide rather than a natural disaster. Imagine if you lived here, how you might feel about rising sea levels. In the past 10 years, a third of the Marshall Islands population has migrated to the U.S., and sometimes they're referred to as climate refugees, as rising sea levels cover the land of their islands, threaten their homes, and leave less area to inhabit. But don't take my word for it. Here are some quotes from some actual Marshall Islanders. This mother says, "This land is vital to our lives. My family farms this land and sells to the community and markets. We have been in Majuro all our lives, and we will be here forever." Majuro is a community in the Marshall Islands. This man says, "I see loss of vegetation in our coastal areas because of frequent flooding. This place is our life. Our food, water, and livelihoods depend on this small land." This man says, "I have experienced droughts 5 times and flooding from the sea is becoming more frequent. The waves are bigger and stronger. They are eroding the coast and taking away people's graves." Imagine that. Imagine if that was your beloved family member's grave and rising sea levels were threatening the cemetery where they were buried and their coffins floated out to sea. This is a crisis that is difficult for me to imagine as someone living in Boise, Idaho, and sometimes Tucson, Arizona. Here's another quote. She says, "Flooding seems normal and frequent these days. This year, my house and crops were severely damaged. All of Rita, which is a community in the Marshall Islands, was flooded. Some of our ocean coastal areas are completely eroded." As a result of these intensely felt effects of global climate change, Marshall Islanders acknowledge climate change before the Western world, noting flooding and coastal erosion were threatening their crops, homes, and entire cities. So the government of the Marshall Islands strictly reduced carbon emissions there. They're strong climate advocates. But in reality, this tiny nation, which is very much affected by rising sea levels, cannot make a dent in global carbon emissions. So I'm curious, what responsibility, if any, do you think major emitters like the US, China, have to people of the Marshall Islands? Here's another layer of complexity. Historically, the Marshall Islands have experienced exploitation, which has increased this population's vulnerability to climate threats. If you've ever heard of the Bikini Atoll, this was a site of nuclear weapons testing by the US between 1946 and 1958, which rendered some of the islands in this nation forever uninhabitable. Other islands contain double the safe limit of radiation, and cancers have been linked to nuclear contamination of the food chain. Nuclear fallout required evacuation to other islands, which increased population density where the people landed and increased economic burden. The health consequences related to radiation, meaning these cancers, are ongoing. And the economy was once infused with U.S. aid for infrastructure, supporting the nuclear weapons testing that went on. But that aid did not include economic development to make communities stronger. And so when the U.S. suddenly left in 1958, people who had had jobs for the last 12 years supporting the U.S. government workers were suddenly unemployed. And so when we left, there was a sudden experience of poverty. This type of consideration of historical, political, and economic context for current environmental challenges is called political ecology, and this is the third lens that you have been introduced to during this video. So cultural materialism, ethnoecology, now political ecology. The political ecology of the Marshall Islands compounds its vulnerability to climate change as a nation. It's a small nation with low international influence, with close proximity to the ocean. As an island, there's nowhere to go. In the U.S., if Miami is threatened, people in Miami can move inland. But as an island, that is not an option. Additionally, resources are limited, unemployment is high, and poverty is an issue, which makes enacting any environmental solutions more challenging. And due to historical exploitation of the environment, which left high levels of radiation, there are ongoing ramifications, and by that I'm talking about the cancers. So imagine your island home is being threatened by rising sea levels, and you have to muster the energy to make a decision of whether or not you're going to abandon the homeland where your ancestors and you have lived, to move to another country over the sea, and you have to make that decision while simultaneously battling cancer. This is a compounding of vulnerability that is best understood from a holistic perspective that environmental anthropology aims to perform. So I've given you two ethnographic examples to contrast our Western perspective. These were the Arctic hunters of Greenland, which you read about, and Marshall Islanders. In both examples, global change is an immediate existential crisis. And in both examples, political influence of the affected peoples is low. Poverty or lack of access to resources constricts behavioral adaptability to these changing environmental conditions. And in both cases, these communities didn't contribute to global change, yet they are among the most affected. So this brings up a social injustice issue. To review, we've noted that there are different ways to think about environmental problems, and these were called frames in the assigned reading. Example conflicting frames include thinking about an environmental problem in terms of a loss of pristine nature versus a loss of cultural heritage. Or an economic inconvenience, like if my avocado prices go up, versus a true existential threat for my nation. I've also introduced you to the names of some theoretical lenses through which anthropologists understand environmental issues. And what these theoretical lenses allow you to do is think about simultaneous truths. One was cultural materialism, the second was ethnoecology, and the third was political ecology.